Hello, Scott.
Hi, Isaac. Hi.
Hey. Nice to see you. You're still a little bit pixelated, but I think it's gonna be like the last time we talked. We wait a little bit and you're gonna come in clear. How are you?
Pretty good. Your voice is very soft.
Okay, good. So is yours, thank you. I wanted to ask you, what time is it over there now?
Wait, hold on. Now, say again.
What time is it over there now?
Right now it's almost noon. It's about 5 minutes to noon.
Okay, cool. So what are you working on?
I'm working on my new graphic novel.
Oh, cool. What is it going to be about?
It's sort of a romance, sort of about art and death and everything. It takes place in New York. It's
Cool.
very operatic.
Oh, cool. But this is the first graphic novel you're going to be doing like since Lincoln, right?
I'm amazed you even remember that. Yeah, it's about 480 pages, so it's a little bit more ambitious than that one.
Wow. How far along are you now?
I'm working on page 361.
Wow. How long have you been working on it?
About 4 years.
Whoa. Cool.
In 2 of those years, the first 2 years I spent on layouts. I was working on the layouts. And I did a lot of revisions, a lot of changes, but it was worth it.
So when you start actually drawing, you usually have like all of the layouts, everything set out in advance, or do you change stuff while you work as well?
I do change things a little. In fact, I'm sort of doing a 5th revision now as I draw the pages. Sometimes I'll make little changes to the layout of the script. But the way I do it, my layouts they're very, very, we'd say anal here in the States. That is, I try to make them as much like the book as possible. So before I draw any of the finished art, I have a sense of what each and every composition is going to be like.
Okay, and you don't get bored, like just fulfilling the stuff you drew like several years ago? Because I remember having that feeling. I remember having this feeling of like when I was doing like my first really long graphic novel, that I was doing, I would do like the whole layouts, and I would feel like for the whole year, I was just like fulfilling the task I set for myself 1 year ago, you know?
Well, the way I've worked has always been, it means that when I'm drawing, sometimes it can be stiff if I'm not careful. But this time the layouts were a little bit rougher, a little bit more loose. And because of that, I was able to make the finished art, I think, a little bit more loose too. And for some reason, it doesn't bug me as much this time as it used to. I'm working all digital. That is, it's all done I'm drawing everything on this Cintiq tablet where a monitor where you just draw directly on the screen.
Okay.
But it's very loose. It's very hand drawn, and it looks hand drawn. And I came up with kind of rough brushes, so it would be a little bit messy.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I heard you have, I remember reading in the interview, you haven't picked up like an actual brush for years.
Yeah, it's true. I really haven't. I used to have my Winsor Newton Series 7 Finest Sable brush, and I'd be very careful. Will Eisner taught me how to wrap a little tape around the brush so that the bristles wouldn't get messy. But I haven't done it in many, many years.
But it looks very nice. Like your last, Understanding Comics, you still draw by hand.
Yeah, Understanding Comics was drawn on traditional Bristol board, but I used a felt brush for that one. So that was it's like a marker, but it has a flexible tip.
Yeah.
And some technical pens for other things.
Cool.
And then I had a friend, my friend Bob Lappin did the lettering.
Okay. Okay. You didn't do the lettering yourself. Okay. I wanted to ask you, like when you first started doing Understanding Comics, I remember like in the introduction, you have this conversation with Matt Fiesel who says like, aren't you a little bit young to be doing this?
Yeah.
Did you have this reaction, but you were like a bit under 30 when you were doing it, right?
Yeah, I was 33 when it was published. I guess so I was working on it when I was about 31 years old. I'm 52 now, so it was a long time ago. It's actually, just last month was the 20th anniversary of the publication of Understanding Comics here in the States.
Wow, 20 years last week.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
And it was a huge success, right? Understanding Comics.
Well, you know, what's funny is when we made the book, my wife and I, we thought, you know, maybe it'll sell 60,000 copies, maybe it'll sell 6,000 copies. And then the orders came in, and it was for 6,000 copies. And we were like, oh, okay, well, it was worth a try. And then the reorders started coming in. And they've been coming in ever since, so that was nice.
That's great.
But, you know, and it's, I think in about 16, 17 languages now.
Wow, really cool. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the debate that was going on when Understanding Comics came out. You know, like there was this huge controversy about, particularly with R.C. Harvey, whether comics was just sequential art or whether it was connected to the interplay of words and pictures and so on. And I think your answer was basically always that it doesn't have to have words because you always have mute comics.
Yeah, I still feel that way, and R.C. Harvey still feels that way, actually, too. I saw him in Colorado just last year, about a year ago. But we always have fun, you know, debating it. But I think that for me, if my definition means that we lose a few single-panel cartoons and those people become cartoonists, I think that's better than if... with the words and pictures definition, we have to lose somebody like Jim Woodring, you know, who I think is a brilliant cartoonist. And for me, what he does is very much comics. Whereas, you know, a single panel comic like, well, we can see, I call it a comic, even though I'm saying it's not a comic, but something like, you know, The Family Circus or Far Side. These are great cartoons, but I think that the people who make them, they think of themselves mostly as cartoonists anyway, not so much comics artists, you know?
No, I
agree. I don't worry about it too much. You know, I did a chapter on it 20 years ago and I moved on.
Yeah. No, and you talk a lot about how important it is to use the right interplay of words and pictures anyway, so like you acknowledge that this is a huge part of the deal.
Well, it's very exciting, yeah, for how you combine words and pictures. But you know what the big thing was with the whole definition? Is that for me, it wasn't that I wanted to draw this line saying, here's what comics are and what comics aren't. For me, what was exciting was this idea that I could draw this line saying, here's what comics have been, and much, much bigger, you know, this is what comics can be. Because when you look at comics as sequential art, you see that there's a much bigger map that you can draw and many, many more things that can begin to come in that should belong to that family.
Exactly, I had the same feeling that what you were trying to do is actually to expand the definition of comics so it wouldn't be defined just by what comic history made of it, right? Yeah,
it was trying to get it out of that box that the past had put it in.
But what would you say like to the stuff that people said that like the problem was that in this way the stuff that would also come under the definition of comics would be like Greek vases and Roman friezes and so on, and they would claim that like comic is a particularly historical art that started at the beginning of the 20th century that is linked to the mass production of newspapers and so on, and that you can't formalize it beyond that.
Yeah, well, I think that, you know, what they were concerned about was that I was tearing comics apart from their historical heritage. I was saying that, you know, that taking the child and tearing it from the mother, from the family. But words have more than one meaning. And yes, you could say comics, comic books, cartoons, all of these things have a connection to history. They all have a continuity that goes back. And I'm saying you can still use the word to mean those things. You can still use the word comics just to mean the things that were printed in 4 colors and have staples, or the things that came in newspapers. That's fine. But I'm saying that there's this other thing. There's this art form. And the art form has been found at various times throughout history. And that it's worthwhile to look at the art form too. and see what we can learn from those ancient forms. You know, sometimes people think that it's a little more expensive than it is. For instance, I've heard many people think that, or say that I think that Egyptian hieroglyphics are comics. I don't actually say that. In fact, if you go back to understanding comics, I say that they're not. That they're just representing phonetic, sounds, even though they may be pictures. But I do think certain Egyptian wall paintings, things like the Bayeux Tapestry, pre-Columbian picture manuscripts, I think those are comics. I think if you look very closely and you read them panel for panel, you realize that the only things that might disqualify them are style or the order you read them in. Those things shouldn't disqualify them.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really good point. It's like the point that, Jared Diamond makes in his Guns, Germs and Steel about writing, that writing was actually invented a couple of times before, but it never evolved like into actual writing in the way it's used today, because it was too isolated. It didn't catch on, I think he talks like about they found this disc in the middle of Greece, like way before Greece ever adopted writing, that actually had the writing symbols on it, but it never caught on. So I think it's maybe kind of the same things with comic, like the form was found before, but it never developed because it lacked the technology. Probably like the mass newspaper printing technology provided that.
But what's interesting is that those isolated inventions of writing that didn't thrive, we still see them as part of the same art form. Exactly. We're saying this didn't lead to a long family of writing, but it was still writing, it was still the written language. Exactly. And that's what I'm saying about those isolated inventions of comics.
Exactly, really good. And one question that I wanted to ask you, like you wrote a whole book reinventing comics about the future of comics in digital form, and you later also wrote these columns, I Can't Stop Thinking, which are probably an even better way of examining the issue, because you actually examine it through to prove the point.
Although they get old fast, of course, and most of those were done over 10 years ago. Yeah. And of course, time has really caught up with them, and some of them I think are less relevant than others. But yeah, it was easier to show that stuff on the web than it was in print.
Yeah, because I think your strength in all of your books are that, like, at the same time as you're explaining something, you're also showing it. Like you even do that in making comics. So if you want to talk about digital art, it's really cool that you did.
Yeah, it was the big problem with reinventing comics was that it was harder to show what I was talking about once I got to that second half of the book.
Cool. So what do you think about digital comics now? Now it's like 10 years past, and to me it seems that like some comics are using the advantages of the internet. They're using like slightly different formats, but they didn't really go into the infinite canvas so much. They just kind of got shorter. They're not doing so much traditional pages anymore. It's more like gag cartoons of about 4 panels. Some of them are doing animations, like Cyanide and what it's called, Cyanide and Candy. No, Cyanide and Happiness. Yeah, they're doing like animations in some part of it. They're doing sound effects. There's lots of hyperlinks, but there's not this like huge taking advantage of the infinite canvas, of the hyperlinks, of like alternative ways of making comics that you imagined, like the ones where you just like click on a link and you can go into different directions, lots of interactivity. This hasn't really caught on, I feel.
Yeah, no, it hasn't. I think what we found was that short strips, the gag strips, they've been a much more successful evolution online, because they seem to conform best to how people surf. And the long stuff, the online equivalent of graphic novels and comics, they've had a harder time. And I think that there are a lot of reasons for that. I do think that ultimately, whatever mode of reading you choose, it has to be something that allows the reader to forget that they're reading. If you want to create a long story, if you want to do Persepolis or Mouse or Jimmy Corrigan online, then by the time you're reading the 10th, the 11th panel, you really shouldn't be thinking about the way it's presented anymore. And a lot of the ways they mix sound and motion, they constantly remind you of the form of what you're reading, and I don't think that works as well. So So that's one of the problems. I also think another problem is that people are still clinging to shapes and presentations that have a lot to do with the shape of print, like that is the shape of print, you know. This is the natural shape that our eyes can form to, and yet many pages are print shape because they hope to print them later, or just because they don't know any better. I do think that we will find a comfortable balance. Screen fitting pages and scrollers. There are actually a lot more people just recently, just the last couple of years, playing with that idea of just a continuous scroll. It's the standard way of doing it in Korea now. You have individual artists who've done some very nice things, like Daniel Liske in Germany, or Pat Grant in Melbourne, or Emily Carroll in Vancouver.
Where you have just like one long page and just scroll down it.
Yeah, well, I mean, usually they're vertical scrollers these days. People seem to be finding that a natural way to go. And as I say, they're very, very common in Korea. That seems to be the standard way to do it there. So different cultures are embracing it at different speeds to different degrees. But, you know, eventually people sort it out. It takes time.
Yeah, a colleague of ours here in Slovenia did like a really interesting comic inspired by your meditation on internet comics, which was like a huge canvas where you would zoom into the next scene. So like the biggest scene was, like the first panel was the biggest, and then in the background you could already see the second scene. But the final scene was so small,
Yeah, that's like, this is what we call the x-axis in design. This is the y-axis, and that's the z-axis. That's like doing depth. And I think that's a really interesting way to organize it. All you're doing is you're taking the basic idea of comics, 1, 2, 3, and you're just turning it. And that's a really cool, a very cool approach.
And it's really one thing that you can only do in digital stuff,
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, no, actually you can do it in space. I mean, you could just create a gallery exhibit where each panel was one after another. Although if it's embedded, if you're zooming in, then you know, pretty soon panel 1's bigger than the known universe. It's a little hard to do.
It's a really nice effect. I also wanted to ask you, about making comics, like your latest book. Which year did this come out, Making Comics?
It came out in the States in 2006.
Okay, because it's been translated, I think, in Slovenian in 2010. We have 2 of your books translated, and we're selling both of them here. And I thought it was really, really nice. I remember when I was a kid, I used to read lots of this stuff about how to make comics and so on. And this is like one of the best ones at all, because you put like a lot of stress on being clear, on telling your story clearly. You focus a lot on beginner mistakes, like drawing faces too similar, trying to get away with really fancy stuff and obscuring the story and so on.
No, I'm glad you liked it. That was a fun book to draw, and I felt like I was returning to some of the things that worked well with understanding comics when I did Making. Also, I had the right tools. I was finally drawing on a Cintiq, which seemed to be a little less stiff than reinventing comics. But also, I saw a need, you know, and I felt that there was a generation of artists, a lot of them girls, a lot of them having grown up reading manga, that I was hoping to speak to. And so far, the evidence is that it's working that way. I'm hearing from a lot of young artists who found that making comics was useful. So that's been very gratifying.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I also thought that you like evolved a lot in your style. I think it's like drawn way better than understanding comics was as well. Not that understanding comics was drawn poorly, but this one is drawn really well. Like the stuff you do with the faces and the expressions, that's like really, really good. Yeah.
Well, now of course I get to apply that in the graphic novel, and people will be looking very closely at the graphic novel. If I don't do it right, they're going to give me hell.
Yeah, you know? It's your.
Yeah, I really have to get it right. Otherwise, it'll be so embarrassing after that.
Well, it's really interesting that you're doing a graphic novel now, because I figured, like, okay, I read Zot, and I also read Zot online, but I found that, like, all of those comics were, you didn't seem as passionate inside them as you do inside the theory books, you know? Like, even Zot online, it's a really interesting experiment in showing all the stuff that you can do in digital comics, but lots of it feels like like you're still trying to demonstrate something out of theory in it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah. So I'm really interested to see. Yeah.
No, that's true, and I think that one of the challenges of doing the graphic novel now is, can I put the theory aside? Can I create something that feels like the story was the most exciting thing for me, and I was less interested in just demonstrating things? And that's what I'm trying to do now, and I hope that I've managed to move in that direction, that the story is the most important thing for me now.
That's great. Yeah, because in your books it feels like the story is the most important thing, it's like in understanding comics, but it's the story of theory.
That was it, yeah. In understanding, I wasn't putting form over content, it's just that the content was about the form.
Exactly, yeah.
And so it was a nice match that way.
Cool. Okay, I'm gonna turn the mic over to the audience now, see what they have to ask you.
Okay.
I hope you'll still be able to hear, because right now I had to hoist my laptop on my shoulder, so I hope you'll be able to hear the audience, otherwise I'll just repeat their questions.
Yeah, you may have to repeat the questions.
Okay.
And it's dark enough that I actually can't see anything, it's just a black screen.
Yeah. Before you could at least see me, but now once I put it on my shoulder, it just went black, so...
Yeah.
Okay, has anybody got a question for Scott? We got one. Gaspar?
Hello, Scott. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So, my question first, a very general one. Which of today's comics do you read, or which are some of, let's say, today's most interesting comics that you would like to really, point out and recommend?
Were you able to hear that?
This may surprise you, but one of the most interesting things I read recently was a comic for children by Raina Telgemeier. It's called Drama, and it's just read mostly by 13, 14-year-old girls here in the States. But I like to see comics changing for kids, and one of the things that I'm seeing now is more and more this idea of emotion as action. This is something we didn't do a lot here in the States for a long time because they were all, superhero stories and science fiction. But this idea that every time a character's emotion changes, it deserves its own panel, that's revolutionary, and it's actually going to change the way young people read comics. So even though the comics, they look very simple, they may look very conventional, I actually think that's one of the more interesting things that's happening right now. And then, of course, there are interesting things going on online. Some of the craziest art comics, the collaborative comics that are going on online are nice. Let's see, Michael DeForge, for example. Just some of the more strange abstract stuff going on. I like, it's sometimes hard to say exactly. One of my favorite recent graphic novels was Market Day by James Sturm. I really like that book, and I've read it a few times, and it really settled in me. Let's see, what do I like? I don't know, it's hard to say, a lot of different things, but it's hard to think of them all at once, because they're all just so different.
Thanks. Sure. Anybody else? A question for Scott? We have a question in the back.
Hey, Scott.
Hey.
First question, what was the first comic that really convinced you that this was something you wanted to spend your entire life on? Second question, did you ever have doubts about, becoming a comic artist? And third question, did you ever quit? And if you did, how did you come back?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'll need the question repeated, please.
What was the first comic that really convinced you that this is what you want to do with your life? And
did you ever have doubts about becoming a comic artist?
To answer the second question first, no. Actually, I was a very, very confident kid, And once I wanted something, I never turned back, never questioned it. I don't know why. I would just seem to have that kind of personality where I was just very confident and very certain that I'd do it. Something about where I grew up, or I don't know what it was exactly. The first comic, I remember sitting in a friend's house when I was about 13 years old, and he had some Jim Steranko comics. He was an artist who worked on superhero comics back in the 60s and 70s. And he was one of the more adventurous artists. And I remember one comic, he used some images that were similar to Salvador Dali's paintings, like The Persistence of Memory. And as a kid, I really liked Salvador Dali. And I remember, even though I was only 13 years old, I remember looking at those comics and thinking, maybe comic books had, that there was some art there. Maybe there could be art. Maybe something unusual could be done with them. And that's where I started from as a kid. And it was only when my friend Kurt lent me, oh, I can see you now. Hi, everybody. It was only when my friend Kurt lent me a bunch of big stacks of comics to read. There were superhero comics because, it was the United States and I was 14 years old. But when he lent me a big stack of those comics and I read them, and then I became interested in comics as a reader, and I realized that the real art of comics was being a storyteller. And so I tried to become a storyteller, but that part of me that was interested in the art form, it was still in there. And because of that, it was always watching too. And then in 1993, that's when Understanding Comics came out, where the whole time that I was trying to just tell the story, there was also a part of me that was also trying to figure out how stories worked and how the medium worked, and that led to Understanding Comics.
Anybody else? A question for Scott? Anyone? David, maybe? I know David is like a huge fan of yours, that's why I'm asking.
Oh. I can actually see you. Okay. David is asking what you think about animation and sound being introduced into comics. Wait, actually, could you repeat that?
David asks, what do you think about animation and sound being introduced into comics, into digital comics?
I think that I think it actually can work, but it seems to work best when it's looped. So, for instance, if you have here, let's panel 1, right? Panel 2. Wait, am I going left to right or right to left? I don't know. Whatever. Okay, panel 1.
No, you're okay.
Panel 2. Panel 3. All right. If panel 2 has a little animation in it, but it just keeps doing the same thing over and over, we still have that sense that panel 1 came before panel 2, and panel 2 comes before panel 3, and it feels like comics. And not only that, but I think that anyone reading it, even if they've barely even experienced comics, for them it's very easy to understand what it all means. So, maybe you have somebody walking to a restaurant, and then panel 2, they're eating a bowl of spaghetti, right? But the fork is just going like that, up and down and up and down and up and down. And now you see them walking away from the restaurant and they're really fat. Everyone understands that. They understand it and they get used to it very quickly. And I've seen comics like this. There's this one comic from Montreal where somebody's coming home drunk after a party. And it works perfectly, and every panel is a looped animation. Because what's happening is you're saying that the panel that's animated, it's a steady state. That is, it represents something that ultimately doesn't change. Feels like comics. But I think that when you try to do something like the Watchmen motion comic, I don't know if anyone has seen that, where all the words, somebody's reading all the word balloons and you sit back and it's like an animation. I think that's just comics trying to become something else. It's like a way of saying that, well, the movies are more entertaining than comics. It should all be like movies. And I just think that's very, very sad, and it doesn't work terribly well. But mostly, what the most important thing is, no matter what you introduce into digital comics, there has to be that sense that once you start reading, the mode of presentation doesn't change. It doesn't become something else while you're reading, because every time the medium changes, you become aware of the medium, and when that happens, you're pulled out of the story. You're no longer in the spell of the story, and as a reader, it's just not as satisfying. And that's why I think the things that do that, they haven't caught on.
Can you recall any example where sound was used well?
Well, sound can be, it's actually the same thing. It's the idea of ambient sound. So if you have like a loop of music or sounds that are just sort of atmospheric and that maybe they change as you change, as you move along, I think that can work. Patrick Farley has done some of that stuff. I think the sound is well used in a comic called Nalz, which is spelled Nawlz. It's very, very weird. But the sound, I think, is very effective.
But it's mostly atmospheric sound. It's not like where you push a button.
Yeah, it's atmospheric or looped. Mm-hmm. I think that can work okay.
What about stuff where you could like push a button and something would go boing?
Well, that's just it. It's like that kind of interaction. It sort of depends. I think that the kind of interaction that works best is if what you're doing is you're pushing a button to maybe, make a panel flip or rearrange panels, things like that. That's kind of interesting because it's keeping the language of comics in there. But if you're just pushing a panel to see a little movie play, I think that tends to tear at the fabric of the medium and makes us less likely to lose ourselves in the story.
Yeah, a friend and I were talking about the possibility of making like a digital comic, which would be like one huge painting that you could move along, but you could like open doors, get inside stuff, like almost like a video game, push stuff and sound would come out. But maybe it would actually still be a comic, I'm not sure.
Well, the thing is, in comics, everything has a spatial metaphor. You're saying that as you move through space, you move through time. So long as you keep to that, you can do all kinds of crazy things. You can have the comic turn a corner. You can have, panels that open like doors. That was the very first thing that was on my site in 1998, was a panel that opened like a door. All of those things are possible. But like with choose your own path, right? This idea that, okay, I can do this or I can do that. The forking path, it has to literally take a path. You have to literally see where you're going, which